From Professor X and Hela to Shanna and Stegron, today's update really knocks it out of the park. Let's go ahead and dive on into the details, shall we? Let's start with the change to my least favorite card in all of Marvel Snap, Professor X. Professor X will now be a 5/2 with the ongoing effect. Moving is the only way to add or remove cards here. Seconder starts off their justifications for this change by explaining a little bit why it took them so long to come to this. They note that while Professor X has been popular in the past, he was rarely one of the better performing cards in his decks, citing the Thanos control deck of old where he was often played previously. They then go on to say that things have changed in the more recent metagame, and Professor X has been putting up strong results not just as a counter to other strategies, I assume they're talking about Hela here primarily, but also just a variety of other matchups. They then go on to say that Professor X is not something that they want to be a dominant element of the metagame. They waited to take action like they're taking today because they wanted to see if the format could adjust organically around him, and it has explicitly failed to do that. I think this is important to call out because there are going to be a lot of people that complain that Second Dinner is only changing this card because of people like me who complained endlessly about it, and I did. I hated the old Professor X. But this is really important. The reason why, despite my complaining for literally 18 months about this card, that they're finally changing it now is because their metrics show that it needed to change. They waited extra time to see if new tools they even added to the game, like War Machine, could provide sufficient counterplay, and it just didn't exist in the metagame. He needed a change for power level reasons, not because of people like myself being vocal. This Professor X change is a big deal for a couple of reasons. The first is that allowing cards to move into and out of Professor X's lane means that the established combo of Professor X plus Cannonball is null and void unless Professor X is locking down an already full location. The most dominant Professor X decks create this hopeless experience on the last turn of the game where they're going to deterministically cannonball you and destroy your card because they're already winning the Professor X lane and you're just locked out. That's just straight up not going to work anymore. They're going to knock your biggest card into the Professor X lane, likely losing that for themselves, and I envision that this change simply means that X and Cannonball no longer belong in the same decks together. Past that, this creates new organic counterplay to Professor X, which is a good thing. Previously, only effects like Claw, Miss Marvel, and Jeff the Baby Landshark were able to get stats into that X lane with any amount of consistency, and now there's a whole range of cards that will be able to do that. You'll have to be able to contest things like Nocturne, or Captain Marvel, or even Vision that can move freely across the board with meaningful amounts of stats, meaning you're not just going to be able to guess well with your Professor X on turn 4 and have your lane be won trivially or retreat when you guess wrong. Speaking of turn 4 Professor X, that's another thing that's going to be way less common with this change. Professor X is getting a buff on his stat line up to 2 points of power, which means Ravonna, who honestly I think is one of the best cards in the game right now, is no longer going to reduce his cost. That alone, on top of the extra counterplay, is going to be a huge difference for this card. As someone who's been one of the most vocal Professor X haters for a long time, I think this is a really elegant change to the card, and I'm optimistic for what it means for the future of Marvel Snap and being able to play and move my cards around on the board in the important end turns. Speaking of Cannonball, he's also getting the very smallest amount shaved off the top, which doesn't surprise me. Second Dinner notes that he's had a strong performance not only in Professor X decks, but a variety of other things as well, and they're reducing him to a 5/7 from a 5/8 while keeping his text box the same. I think this is fine. I think Cannonball is still probably a very reasonable card inside of potentially a Nihilist Clutter decks, or especially alongside Dr. Octopus, even if Professor X isn't a simple AB combo for him anymore. Up next, we have a text box change to Hela. Her on reveal will now resurrect all your discarded cards to random locations with -2 power. Second Owner starts off their justification for this change by acknowledging something that I've talked about at length in my content before, which is Hela really lacks counterplay for those who want to be able to target her as an archetype. What I mean by this is, unlike something like, say, Death or Sarah, where if you want to beat them, you can play a card like Mobius, there isn't an ongoing or unrevealed tech card that I can really shove into my deck to give me a better chance against Hela. The best valve for beating Hela is retreating for minimal loss when their combo comes together, or staying in for a minimal win when they ultimately leave because their deck just didn't function. Second Inner goes on to talk about how adjusting Leech down to a 4 cost was their attempt to add one of these cards to the game, but they also admit, as they had previously, that the cure was worse than the disease in that case, and Leech was appropriately reverted. They go on to say in the future, they're going to try some other designs that could potentially give meaningful counterplay to Hela, but it takes time to test and design those cards, even more to get them into the player's hands. So in the meantime, they're giving themselves a balance valve similar to how they changed Galactus to adjust Hela up or down when it merits. What they mean by this is that number 2 inside of Hela's text box is a number that they can adjust if the card is too good or too bad in either direction. If she proves to be too strong in a metagame, they can make it -3 or -4. If she proves to be too weak, they can make it -1 or even 0 at the base cost, but it's still there at face value as a knob that they can turn in addition to her cost and base power to make the card better or worse. Overall, I'm happy to see any change to Hela, and I'm even happier to see Second Dinner acknowledge the very real issue that there isn't a meaningful tech card that players can reach for to fight back against her when they feel like they need to be able to. As far as its impact on the actual change itself, I think the good Hela deck, i.e. not the MODOK Invisible Woman Hela deck, this change will obviously be impactful, but I don't think it's going to be huge. That deck list is often flipping things with 10, 12, even 20 power into play, so losing somewhere between 4 and 8 points of power off its board is still probably going to result in plenty of wins. That being said, I assume that's Second Dinner's goal. Usually when they nerf things, they don't want them to be unplayable. The Hela deck that I expect to really be hurt by this change, however, is the bigger, more linear one, i.e. that MODOK Hela deck, which often packs in that Living Tribunal combo. That deck frequently plays cards like Iron Man, Onslaught, and Living Tribunal that have lower stat lines, and that it wants to double up those stat lines. So losing 2 points off of a bunch of things could realistically be 4 or even 8 points off of each of those things if an Iron Man Onslaught lane was getting set up. Up next, we have another change that's technically impacting Hela that I'm actually a little bit surprised to see. The Ebony Blade is losing half of its ongoing effect. It will still say can't be destroyed, but you will now be able to reduce its power. Second Dinner notes that while they wanted the card to be more resilient than it was before it had this ongoing text, they didn't want it to be completely immune to interaction, which I think is great. I think having protection from either Shang-Chi or Shadow King is good, but both felt incredibly pushed in a lot of situations. They go on to say that by removing the power can't be reduced bit, this means that the Ebony Blade also doesn't get to freely play into places like the negative zone, which wasn't nothing as well. As far as impact goes, I think this is a big deal. Shadow King is a card that's been on the rise since Angela was buffed and Thena was added to the game, and Kitty Pryde is everywhere with the two of those, so having a tech card that people are already playing provide counterplay to the Ebony Blade is huge, especially considering a tech card like Shadow King is usually a dead draw in a matchup like Hela. Up next, we have another change that technically impacts Hela, but not to the card herself. Red Hulk is getting yet another adjustment. He's going to a base 6/10, who will now only get +3 each time your opponent ends the turn with an unspent energy while Red Hulk is in your hand. This means at a baseline with 1 trigger, Red Hulk is the same as he was, but with 2+ triggers, he'll be smaller than all of his previous iterations were. Second Dinner notes that this card isn't super far ahead on data compared to other 6 energy cards, but they still want to rein it in a little bit, so it's perhaps no longer the default big 6-drop. I think this is a good change. I agree, the Red Hulk feels close to a number of cards. There are even a few shells where I was begrudgingly playing stuff like Magneto and Doctor Doom and not Red Hulk, and not just purely for budgetary reasons. And I think with this change, there'll be even more consideration for, do you want the slightly bigger stat line, or do you want something that's meaningfully disruptive like Magneto to be able to yank your opponent's Wong or other tools out from underneath them. Up next, we have a fairly quick turnaround on a buff to our latest season pass card. Gilgamesh is going from a 5/7 to a 5/9. Second Dinner starts off their justification for this change by noting that a few of their other recent go big cards, i.e. Red Hulk and Blob, went a little bit too big, so they were a little bit conservative out of the gate with Gilgamesh, not wanting to repeat on past mistakes, but then go on to talk about that data so far indicates that Gilgamesh has both a low win rate and low average cubes gained, which shouldn't be the case for a card that creates a big swing on the last turn of the game, so they want to dial him up a little bit to add some excitement to a season pass card that I'm sure isn't selling great because he kind of sucks. In the public tracker metrics and my own anecdotal experience, I think 5/7 Gilgamesh is easily one of the worst cards to release into Marvel Snap in the last couple of months. In general, I think people tend to undervalue even a single point of power increase, and Gilgamesh is getting +2 stats here. In decks outside of Blue Marvel decks, my Gilgameshes were regularly hitting somewhere in like the 11 to 13 range, so I'll be like the 13 to 15 range, which is pretty solid for a 5 energy play. And when you have a Blue Marvel deck with the board completely full, he'll now be a 5/20 on the last turn of the game, which is nothing to scoff at, especially when you compare it in tandem with something like Squirrel Gore or Demon or some other 1 energy play to make alongside it. Up next, we have a couple of small power boosts to cards that certainly need it. We have Captain America going from a base 3/2 to a base 3/3, while keeping his recently updated ongoing ability of giving other ongoing cards +2 at his location. Shanna is going from a base 3/2 up to a base 3/4, with Second Dinner acknowledging that they know they've iterated on this card a few times, but she's tricky to get right. While she theoretically has a fairly large power output range, she eats up a lot of your board space to do that. They had kicked around making changes to her in the past, but they wanted to wait to see how things shook out with cards like Mockingbird, and I would assume Gilgamesh in the latest season pass to see if she really needed it. She definitely did. In my existing experience, cards like Debris often outshine Shanna because they're more consistent in what they do to the board and they're disruptive as opposed to Shanna just purely putting out numbers. Will +2 points of base power be the difference maker to make me want to play her over Debris? I'm not sure, but I'm definitely interested in trying to find that out. Lastly, and I apologize for burying the Stegron lead, he is not only going from a 4/6 up to a 4/7, but his on reveal effect now says move an enemy card from here 1 location to the right. I really like this change. It's subtle, but it removes a key element of variance from Stegron's ability. While obviously there's still variance in which cards you're going to hit, being able to control where it's moving lets you make more calculated and predictable choices and lets you synergize more cleanly with other cards in Marvel Snap. You can set up a Kingpin or a Kraven directly to the right of Stegron and know with certainty that when your Stegron happens, you're going to get another 2 points of value off of his on reveal trigger. Will this be the make or break difference in Stegron being a format powerhouse? Probably not, but at least I'll get to bat things around with my favorite Golden Lizard while feeling slightly less bad about it, which at the end of the day is all I really want out of my sweet and mediocre Marvel Snap cards. They hit basically all of the problem children. They buffed some of the terrible pet cards that I love. If I was being a little bit greedy, I think the only other thing I would have liked to see in this OTA is a power reduction to Ravonna, but I think it is worth acknowledging that at least she no longer works with Professor X, which is a direct hit to a number of her strongest performing decks, so perhaps she's going to be fine as a 2/3 once that shakes out. Either way, I'd love to hear which cards you're excited to play with after these changes. Mine is definitely Stegron. If you enjoyed my musing on this topic, be sure to snap that like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any other Marvel Snap updates, including my best decks roundup after these changes Saturday morning.